I was staying with my brother at a cabin in northern Montana, nestled in a dip between the mountains and tucked deep into the trees, and since both Johnny and I were very outdoorsy, this kind of trip was nothing out of the ordinary for us, hanging out in the woods, going on hikes, and exploring the surrounding area. Because of the long drive, we spent the first day taking it easy, staying close to the cabin and soaking in the scenery, and I think it was around 5:30 in the evening when Johnny decided to go for a short walk before it got dark. I barely paid attention, just glanced at him as he headed out and said, "All right," and since he didn't bring a backpack or any gear, I knew he wasn't planning to be gone long. I laid back down on the couch near the fireplace, exhausted from doing most of the driving earlier, and drifted in and out of consciousness as the cabin slowly grew darker with the sun dropping behind the mountains. It wasn't until the only light left was the glow from the fireplace that I realized Johnny still hadn't come back. And at that point it was far too dark for him to be wandering around without any gear. So I jumped up, grabbed my day bag, a headlamp, and a flashlight, and headed outside to make sure he was okay. My first thought was bears. We were deep in bear country, so I was already nervous, but as I walked farther down the path, that nervousness shifted into something else entirely. A bad feeling that made me keep looking over my shoulder like I expected someone to be there, even though I never actually saw anything. About 10 minutes down the trail, I saw Johnny heading toward me, and he looked uneasy, not running, but moving fast, like he was trying to get away from something, and we both started talking at once. Me asking what was going on while he urgently told me to turn around and get back to the cabin. We ended up fast walking back together, and once inside, he told me he'd seen someone watching him from the trees, a man who looked incredibly creepy and seemed to be stalking him as he walked the trail. Johnny explained that he waited until dark to come back because he thought if he returned in daylight, the man might follow him, and even though he reassured me older brother style that it was probably nothing and he was just being cautious, I trusted him and tried to brush it off, assuming it could have been someone with a nearby cabin or just another hiker. We made dinner and spent the rest of the night sitting on the front porch by a campfire, both of us quietly keeping watch even though neither of us admitted it, and as the mountains grew quieter, we eventually went inside and slept until morning. After a quick breakfast, we packed up and headed out for the main hike in the area, climbing to the peak of one of the mountains over the course of about 6 exhausting hours, and by the time we got back, that final hour of walking felt endless. Once inside, Johnny tossed his bag down and said he was going to take a shower, leaving me waiting on the couch since the cabin only had one bathroom, but after just a minute, I suddenly remembered the man Johnny had talked about the night before, which made me get up and look out the windows, half expecting to see someone outside. I went back to the couch, but an uneasy feeling settled over me, and after a few more minutes, I realized the water pump for the shower hadn't started yet. I called Johnny's name, no response, so I walked down the hall, knocked on the bedroom door, and said his name again, feeling deeply unsettled as I slowly cracked the door open. Through the narrow opening, I saw Johnny kneeling in the corner of the room, eyes wide, staring straight at me and subtly shaking his head no, silently begging me to go away, and the terror in his eyes is something I'll never forget. When I pushed the door open fully, I saw a man standing just a few feet from him, wide-eyed in a tired, disturbing way, wearing torn, disheveled clothes with long, oily black hair, and without time to think, I charged at him on pure instinct, only realizing too late that he was raising a gun. I tackled him anyway, and Johnny immediately jumped into action, and together we wrestled the gun away and got him mostly under control, though the man was completely feral, screaming, screeching, clawing, and fighting like nothing I'd ever seen. He wouldn't stop, and after struggling to figure out how to escape, we decided Johnny would hold him down while I ran to get the car ready, quickly throwing our already packed bags inside, starting the engine, and rushing back to help tie him up with whatever we could find, just long enough for us to get away, taking the gun with us as we heard him screaming from inside the cabin while we drove off. Once we reached cell service, we contacted the police, but by the time they arrived, all that remained were the scraps we'd used to restrain him, scattered across the floor, and the man was gone. Johnny later told me that when he went into the room to shower, he'd been caught completely off guard and held at gunpoint, ordered to call me in, but he refused, knowing it would leave me defenseless until I walked in anyway, and to this day, we still talk about how insane it was that I tackled him, something I can't even explain, but which may have saved our lives. The only lead authorities ever had came from the gun we handed over, which was registered to a man who'd been missing for 5 years about 50 miles away, and based on the attacker's appearance, it seemed likely that whoever attacked us had also attacked the gun's owner, leaving him missing as well, meaning that if things had gone even slightly differently, Johnny and I could have shared the same fate. In 2016, I made a 6-hour drive out into the woods to visit my father's old cabin. Located just outside the hometown, he grew up in a place that no longer even qualified as a town anymore, reduced to nothing more than a deserted road lined with abandoned buildings and forgotten storefronts. We never really went there when he was alive because he always said there wasn't much reason to once the town died. But after he passed away, I felt compelled to make the trip, wanting to see the cabin he built with his own hands and maybe restore it just enough to keep it standing for as long as possible. More than anything, I hoped the isolation would clear my head and give me some peace. After arriving, I parked my car behind an abandoned gas station and hiked 2 miles up a thin, rugged trail with all my backpacking gear and tools, prepared to camp outside if the cabin had already collapsed. But to my relief, it was still standing in a small clearing, just a simple rectangular log cabin, vines and greenery crawling up its walls. Inside, there were no locks on the door, trash scattered everywhere, and a musty, rotten smell that made it clear someone had stayed there at some point, likely years ago. I cleared out a corner, unrolled my sleeping bag, and settled in as the sun set. But despite hearing and seeing nothing unusual, I couldn't sleep for more than 30 minutes at a time, constantly waking with a disturbing, unshakable feeling that made for a miserable night. At sunrise, exhausted and questioning whether the trip was a mistake, I brewed coffee on my camping stove and walked through the woods to clear my head, eventually reaching a hill that overlooked the treeline, perfect for watching the sunrise, until I noticed something else entirely. A light glowing in one of the abandoned buildings in the town far below. It shut off suddenly, and while I reasoned it was probably just urban explorers, the coincidence unsettled me. I spent the next hour watching the sun rise before heading back to the cabin to work, resealing and cleaning the exterior. But the entire time that same feeling lingered, growing clearer the longer it stayed. I felt like I wasn't alone. Though the idea of anyone being out there near a decaying cabin in the middle of nowhere felt impossible, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. As night fell, I went inside and lit the old wood stove, sitting by the fire and thinking about my dad, my life, and why I'd come there, until the comforting crackle of the flames was joined by another sound: crunching footsteps outside the cabin. I listened closely and realized it wasn't an animal, and just as whoever it was reached the door, they knocked and called out my father's name, freezing me in place. Shocked and confused, I stood at the door and asked who he was, and after a pause, the man claimed to be an old friend of the man who built the cabin, saying he lived in the abandoned town. I told him my father had passed away, and while he offered condolences, something about his tone felt wrong, forced, hollow, and when he asked me to open the door so we could talk and share the fire, his slow voice carried an impatience that made every instinct in my body scream not to trust him. As I hesitated, his knocking became harsher, his voice more demanding, accusing me of leaving him to die in the cold, even invoking my father's name again. And as fear took over, I backed away and grabbed my hunting knife while he pounded on the door and dropped any pretense of kindness. It went on endlessly until, in a sudden burst of anger, he struck the door and finally walked away into the woods. I stayed awake the entire night, terrified, and at first light, I packed everything, ran from the cabin, and fled the town, grateful to find my car untouched. I drove straight home without stopping, realizing that instead of closure, the trip had left me with more questions: why my father really left that place, who that man truly was, and what he wanted. And I'm certain that if I had opened that door and let my emotions take over, I never would have made it out of that town alive. Back in 2014, during a gap year from college, I was traveling across the US out of my car when I reached the East Coast, and my cousin offered to let me stay at his cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains, a welcome break that sounded perfect after weeks on the road. The cabin turned out to be surprisingly nice, more like a modern vacation home than the rustic log cabins you usually picture deep in the woods, and I was honestly shocked he let me stay there for free. As I moved my things in from the car, I noticed someone standing out in the treeline, far from the path, clearly watching me, and while I initially tried to rationalize it, maybe nearby houses, maybe someone passing through, the feeling stuck with me, especially when I saw him still facing the cabin as I locked my car and went inside. I texted my cousin to let him know I'd arrived safely and casually mentioned the guy watching me, only to see his reply nearly an hour later, well after sunset, saying the cabin sat on 40 fenced acres and no one else should have been there, which immediately turned my unease into dread. When I looked outside again, the darkness swallowed everything beyond the cabin lights, leaving nothing but pitch-black forest, and I closed the curtains with a chill running through me. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but about an hour in, I caught movement through a gap in the curtains and then heard footsteps sprinting through the grass, vanishing into the darkness, which finally pushed me to call my cousin and then the police. The officer arrived fairly quickly but could do nothing with the man gone, leaving me alone again in the cabin, too afraid to haul my belongings back to the car in the dark and instead pacing, checking windows, and delaying sleep as long as I could before finally locking myself in the bedroom. I woke around 4 a.m., far too early, instantly flooded with panic and the urge to check the house, and as I walked the hallway, listening to the wind, I heard thumps at the far end of the cabin near the kitchen and library, followed by the unmistakable shadow of someone moving then stopping before slowly advancing until a figure emerged that I immediately recognized as the same man from the trees. I ran back into the bedroom and locked the door, heart pounding in the unbearable silence, until slow footsteps approached and stopped right outside, the man standing there without a word. Afraid to call for help and trigger whatever he intended, I made a split-second decision to grab my keys, escape through the window, and sprint to my car, speeding away into the darkness. When police later arrived, they found no one, but discovered a broken window lock where the man had entered and noted that the bedroom door secured only by a simple pushpin lock had been opened, meaning he was moments away from getting to me. What haunts me most is realizing he'd likely been there the entire time, watching the cabin and waiting for someone to arrive, and whatever he planned that night is something I'm grateful I never had to find out.